one reason that we need this sort of symbolic renaissance is because symbolism got a bad name because it was abused, and people could, you can make the Bible symbolize lots of things that it doesn't actually mean. And I think that's where this recognition of structure comes in. It's almost like, I like to say, the Bible's got its own guardrails built in.
Well, I had an awesome conversation with Justin and Michael, and I'm glad I get to share it with you all. So welcome in as we talk about kind of a myriad of things related to the nature and the structure of the Bible. So if you're interested in what Michael is up to and what Justin is up to, I will leave links to their work in the description of this video. Glad you're here. Let's get into it. We find ourselves back here yet again, sharing stories. And so one of the stories I'm interested in is a previous conversation, I think, that Justin and Michael, you had. And so maybe just by way of introduction, you can kind of catch me up on that and kind of introduce yourselves a little bit. Because Justin, I know a little bit. Michael, I'm kind of getting to know your work. But I'd love to just kind of hear more from you guys. So,
okay. Yeah.
You can go first, Justin.
Okay. Well, so Michael and I, this is our first recorded conversation. I was saying something on Twitter, something crazy on Twitter, and somebody said, I'm sending in my Jedi. And then he linked you, Michael.
Oh, yeah. That was my mate, Matthew. Yeah. He lives in Sydney, which is a couple of hours away. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. How could I resist?
So my ramblings on Twitter hooked me up with Michael, and then I just looked a little bit into the Theophilus Institute down there in Louisiana, and we started talking about the online magazine that Michael does, and essentially, I'm interested in story. I'm out here in LA. I teach documentary film. I work in camera, as a camera guy in Hollywood. I dabble in screenwriting a little bit here and there, and I'm just interested in the deep archetypal stories. And growing up Christian, I got a degree in philosophy. I got a degree in theology. I've explored the world of theology and art. Any place that there's been conversations about the intersection between faith and film or faith and art. I've been a part of that for the past, let's say, 10 years or something.
Cool.
And so, I think out loud a little bit on Twitter, and I thought that Michael's approach to understanding the patterns in the Bible and the structure of the Bible was really intersecting with the work that I'm trying to do with story structure. And, I kind of have this dual audience thing going on, where I've got certain people of faith that want to hear about the nature of the Bible, oftentimes creative people that want to integrate their faith with their writing or whatever. And then your normal everyday secular folks that find it interesting too.
Yeah.
And that would be kind of like, maybe this is a little deeper version of the hero's journey, a little deeper version of Joseph Campbell or something. But it's all around the imagination, around creativity, writing, narrative. And then the Bible for me is like, I think for me, the Bible is kind of like the light that shines on the everyday anecdotal data of your day-to-day life. And so sometimes looking straight into the light is a bit searing.
Yeah.
And that's why so many of my students and former students and people that I have advised in terms of story oftentimes have trouble applying the Bible to their creative work without it feeling wooden. And I think that's part of it. It's so searingly tense in terms of the piling and piling and piling up of meanings, references on top of references, meanings on top of meanings, resonances on top of resonances, that you kind of like need to go, okay, I need to step back from this a little bit and write my little story here in light of this, and not try to take that and jam it into my story. So that's kind of my approach.
Cool.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, my approach is to get those wire things from Clockwork Orange and just,
get people to see.
Yeah, That's right. Just let it stream in. Yeah. Well, I've been a graphic designer for quite a few decades, and live in the Blue Mountains, which is a couple of hours west of Sydney, which is kind of the road that goes through the centre of a national park. It's got lots of little towns along it, so it's kind of a touristy area. But it's really beautiful, unless there's a fire. But yeah, no. Otherwise, it's really good.
Yeah.
It's a big tourist centre, so I do a lot of work with national parks and tourism as well. But yeah, look, I became a Christian when I was in my mid-teens, and I always ask why. It doesn't matter what it is. My question is why. That's just how I operate. And I always kind of felt that the Bible was a bit strange, and rather than just putting that down to chance or whatever, I just thought there has to be some kind of internal logic to this. And I came across James B. Jordan in about 2006, I think, just by accident. He was quoted in a book that I'd read decades before, and I finally kind of looked him up and listened to his series on Revelation, which is 204 lectures. It took me a couple of years to get. Some of them I had to listen to more than once, but he covers these patterns that we see in the Bible. And I'm a visual thinker, like Justin must be, and I started to see sort of try and systematize these things and sort of condense them down so that anybody could understand them. So you could sort of make them more sort of teachable, more accessible. I don't know if I've succeeded much in that, but systematizing it has actually helped. And I've noticed that there's a few other writers or theologians as well who've come across elements of the same thing and sort of tried to put the whole thing together. And it seems to work. It seems to be vindicated. And so, yeah, that's just then it's a matter of seeing how that helps us to interpret the Bible, that structure is the actual key. It explains why it is the way it is. It's a bit like, what was the phrase? If you want to understand, was it women, wormholes, and something else? I can't remember what it was now, but it was just three things starting with W. But once you get a handle on their internal logic, then they make sense. But until you have that, it just is like trying to figure out what's going on. So yeah. So that's been, and also it's a lot of fun. Being a visual thinker, the Bible's full of symbols. We don't really get in the modern West. There's a lot of stuff we've sort of jettisoned to try and be more scientific about it, but the Bible needs to be read in the way that we would watch a movie or read a novel, and so a lot of it goes over our heads because we're not thinking on the same wavelength. Right. But I guess my goal is to get people to use all the skills that they've learned from reading good books and watching good TV and cinema and plugging that into the Bible, because it uses all the same devices because we're human. So it's and also to get the jokes, because there's a lot of sort of, very pointy jokes in there as well. Yeah. Anyway, I'd much rather be doing this than graphic design. I do enjoy the design, but it's but because I have to work as well, it makes the theology kind of seem sort of naughty.
Well, and I like that. You're in the world of graphic design. It's artistic. Justin's in the world of cinema. It's artistic. I'm a youth pastor. I mean, and actually, as I was about to say, that's not artistic, but I'm going to push back on that, because I actually, in my conversations with youth pastors, I have encouraged them to be more creative. You have to be creative, particularly for young people. And Michael, this is actually a question that's sort of a subtext to one of the reasons I'm interested in talking, is when you start to see the pattern or the story, you start to see it everywhere, and then you move on to kind of the next layer or the next layer. And it's like, I did kind of a deep dive on like the theme of giants and the beast and the sort of John's, I believe John wrote the book of Revelation. That's just me. John's use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation got me to that point. And as soon as you start reading the book of Revelation, understanding kind of what John is using, he's pulling from the Old Testament. You see those Old Testament references everywhere. You see, like, you know, and as a youth pastor, I see the lights go on for young people when they can understand the story. And it's almost like, for me, and I don't know what you guys think about this, it's almost like there's clue, pattern, contact. That's my goal. My goal ultimately is contact. If I'm gonna read the Bible for myself, I want to come into contact with the person of Jesus. If I'm going to teach the Bible to my students, it's because I want them to come into contact with the person of Jesus. But it starts with kind of observing those clues. You observe a clue, and then it forms a pattern. And that's, I think, where we kind of move into story, maybe. And then that, but maybe the thing for me, I'll just give you my take, you guys, and then I'll give you back the floor.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
I didn't grow up in the church. And when I became a Christian, it was actually around the whole, dang it, the name of the books series is totally escaping my mind, but it's the Apocalypse series.
Left Behind.
The Left Behind books. And I didn't really approach them because the people that were talking to me about, they had charts and they had graphs and they were trying to show me the pattern, but it was almost like the pattern had been removed from the story. And so I missed the story. And what I was left with was like a pattern that someone else understood, but I never came into contact. It's like, that's a great pattern for you, or chart or graph. Maybe that's helpful for you to understand it, but it didn't connect with me. And so I think there's something to this, and maybe it's more model and story, or, you know, like I said, clue, pattern, context. There's some movement here that takes place that kind of causes the light bulb.
Drama. All the drama's been removed.
Right.
That's the thing. You've got to get the drama across. What's actually happening? Yeah. Yeah.
And making observations is kind of one of the first steps of that. You're like, oh, why is, one of the ones that I was working on recently was, and it kind of blew my mind. It was actually during a live stream. We were talking about the garments that God made for Adam and Eve. And it's like, where did he get the material for the garment? I always assumed that God had to kill an animal, that there was an innocent sacrifice that took place to make a covering for Adam and Eve after they fell into disobedience and rebellion. So this sacrifice became a covering. And then you look at Cain and Abel. Why does God have regard for Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's? Well, Abel's sacrifice is a reflection back, if that's the case with the garments, it's a reflection back to what God is doing with this garment, with the covering. A Cain's sacrifice is a sacrifice of the earth. He's going back to the rebellion in a sense. He's going back to the fruit of the tree. He wants something, but he doesn't understand the need for the sacrifice. And then in the live stream, I noticed, it struck me, the soldiers removed Jesus's garments. So he's unclothed in that moment. And we so that pattern, and it's like, okay, I observed the pattern, but what is it telling me? Like, what is this? What is the drama there? It's like, well, in a way, and I'm kind of working this out in front of you guys. It's like Cain wanted to go back to the Garden of Eden. Yeah, everybody does. We all want to go back there, but he didn't understand the process to get there. Abel did, and Jesus ultimately displays that. It's like, okay, we don't need the covering anymore. The covering has been removed. Why? Because the sacrifice has been made. You know, and so there's just, I think I don't know if that's a good dramatic, but to me that feels dramatic. That feels like, oh my God,
definitely.
This is what Jesus has done for me. And then
You
Yeah.
you can't understand the New Testament without the whole Bible. Like you
Right.
can't play Bible Jenga. You can't sort of pull bits of it out, and
Right.
it's all part of the construct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Like we could just be also honest. It's like, okay, sometimes that's just hard. It's hard to maintain the, I don't know if it's like, it's hard to see that the Bible is just this big, it's all having a big conversation. Like the book of Revelation is picking up on all these other things from all the other books, but it's not the only book that does that. It's like constantly
that's right.
happening in these books as they're,
Yep.
yeah. So,
Yes. There's always more to see. It doesn't matter how much, I've read. There's always, I think part of the strength of getting a handle on the structure is that the structure itself is a dramatic sequence. It's not just a chart. And because the Bible uses the same pattern over and over again, the number of each instance of the pattern helps interpret every other instance, which means the number of connections you can make is basically infinite. One I'll point out is that Israel's annual calendar, in Leviticus 23, it runs through the different feasts, including the Sabbath at the start. But the number 6 is the Day of Atonement, which literally means the Day of Coverings. And so the pattern of events in the garden follows that actual pattern of the feasts, even though that doesn't turn up until Leviticus.
right.
And so when God covers Adam and Eve, that's the Day of Atonement step. When he deals with Cain and lets him off the hook, like he let Adam off the hook, that's the Day of Atonement step. And then, of course, Revelation is apocalypse literally means a revelation or an uncovering.
Uncovering, yeah.
And so Jesus is coming to judge those who exposed him and rendered him naked. And he's coming to uncover them because they have rejected his atoning blood. And so that's why they call on the rocks and the hills to cover them. So the key word there is covering. And it's just, once you sort of see that the idea is like, well, if you're not covered by sacrifice, then you're naked before God. And so the actual structure is this atonement or some kind of judgment step. We're talking about the hero's journey, like in the first Star Wars movie follows the same pattern, and the Day of Atonement is blowing up the Death Star. That's sin being dealt with, it's right. This is the judgment step here. So,
Michael, you can talk about, you have, I think I got this from one of your books. The idea that when you go off the path for whatever reason, you have to cover yourself, right? So for example, if you lie, okay, now you got to cover yourself. You got to go, well, all right, now I got to cover over this mistake, right? So you could look at Uriah dying when David has his mistake as the covering, but that's his covering. Didn't I get that from you? Or did I just somehow infer?
Well, no, look, and that's a good inference because it's exactly it's fig leaves. That's what Adam and Eve did. They covered themselves with leaves, and they were then God comes looking for fruit, spiritual fruit, and they're just covered in dead leaves.
Here's another interesting one. I always thought about why Cain ends up building a city. He builds a city because he's afraid. God is, in a sense, commissioned him out into the wilderness. He's supposed to go into the wilderness, but he doesn't. He's afraid. So what does he do? He builds a city. He covers himself. And what would they have built with? They would have built with rocks and stone. He covers himself. The shelter is a stone shelter, which, Mike, you were just talking about. Like, look, we want to cover ourselves with the stone for fear of God's judgment. And yet, so who does he draw out? He draws Abraham out of the city and puts him in the wilderness where he doesn't have that, right? And you can think of Nimrod as well. He's Babel, right? He's connected to Babel. He's connected to other cities, but that to me is key when we get to the book of Revelation. It's like, so this is Babylon, is that city. Cain built a city for himself. He's not looking for the city that God would build. He's not like Hebrews 11 would tell us, that the people of God are looking for that city. Abel was looking at what God was doing, and his sacrifice reflected that. Cain was not looking for what God was doing, and his sacrifice essentially is, in a sense, a nod back to the garden, maybe. But it's sort of a meh. I don't know. It's a half-hearted sacrifice, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, and
Sorry, Justin.
oh, no, I was just going to say the covering. If you think of the walls of a city as a thicker skin, at first you got to, so there's a sense that it's not just the judgment of Yahweh that he's afraid of. It's actually other people, because he said, he says, if anyone finds me, because now I'm a murderer,
Right?
So
And
now
they'll kill me.
if anyone finds me, so now what do you have to do? So you think of it like, okay, if you go, let's say, into an area where there's a lot of crime. Okay, you have to build bigger walls. You have to have thicker skin. You got to start wearing that necklace with little spiky things on it. You got to put on leather. You got to put tattoos with knives on you, right? You got to put those layers and layers and layers on top, because you're in a world of thorns. You're in a world of sin. You're in a world of beasts, you could say, right? So to go back to the safe place, you have to take off those layers, So it's like kind of like if you're out there in the world where you got to be super, super harsh, then you got to go back and you got to take those layers off in order to get back into that kind of place of shalom, So there's something going on there as well, I think, where it's like, there's what I found in the Bible is that there are natural consequences due to the grooves of creation, due to the way the world works, to these certain actions. And that's just what happens. Like, that's what happens when you step out of the garden. Then you're going to need to put on these layers.
Yeah, there's no escape from the pattern in a sense. It's you'll just fulfill it in relief. It'll be the opposite each time. There's no real escape from the will of God in that sense. It's either the path of light or the path of darkness, but they're both the same in a sense. It's just that one has negative consequences. One thing that James, Jordan, and Peter Lightout bring out is the fact that when Eve was created, she was actually constructed. She was built, and so the same word is not used again until Cain builds his city, and so in a sense, the city is already a bride in Genesis 2. So the city is kind of like like the glory of the husband is the wife. She is, in a sense, his garment of glory, but also his city. So in Revelation, you have the Lamb who's the light of the city, and then the city is the bride. So there's the idea that she's the city is an extension. It's kind of like you have your clothes, and then as you say, there's these layers. But the architecture is important. There's so much of the text that just goes on with a whole lot of architectural details that are a bit mind-numbing. But once you sort of, I found once I had the visual key, and then you start to see this architecture is actually shaping a lot of stories where it's not even mentioned, but it's almost like God just grabs whatever's lying around and builds a tabernacle out of the story. So it's sort of like, I call it a theoscape. Wherever he turns up, he sort of builds his court in heaven. He builds a replica of it somewhere. So you can see it in the story of David and Goliath, and it actually works through the same sort of architectural pattern. He's actually putting the bits and pieces together, and of course, the high priest day of atonement step there is the death of Goliath. He's gets his head smashed in and then cut off, and so it's architecture is important, and it's the tabernacle is shaped, the furniture is shaped like a cross. So every story has the cross in it. Implicitly, it's there somewhere, because it's a model of the world as well as a model of man. But it's also a dramatic process that it works through. So once you, especially in Revelation too, it's an example is the bit where it says the angels come out of the sanctuary with 7 bowls, and they're going to tip the bowls out in judgment. That little passage works through the tabernacle sequence and puts the bowls right in the center which aligns them with the menorah, the lampstand. And so even though it doesn't say it, it's implying that the 7 bowls are from the top of the lampstand, because it had 7 branches, and they had little bowls that sat on top that were separate, that had the oil in them. So basically, those who had rejected Pentecost and didn't want to be human lamps with flames, at Pentecost, they were going to get Holocaust, which comes from the Hebrew word for go up, and that's where we get burnt offering from. It just means go up in smoke, So the judgment there is on the great city is, well, you wanted to ascend, which is what go up means. So your smoke will go up forever and ever, and it's actually the light, or the light of the law, that's tipped out in 7 bowls upon the city. And that's why the book starts with the 7 churches as 7 lamps. It's their light that actually exposes the city. So this stuff, it's not obvious, but once you get a grip on the language, it is repeated. There's a few things that James Jordan said that he'd say something and I go, that's just crazy. I'm sorry, there's just not enough there for me to get a grip on it. But then as I'm reading the Bible, there it is again, there it is again, and then in Revelation. And so these repeated themes are actually what vindicates it. They're the proof. You've got more than one witness. You've got a whole jury, and each one says, yep, there it is.
Right.
And so that's how you build the case.
Yeah. And I wonder if, and this is sort of like just me, I didn't grow up in the church, and I still kind of maintain some level of skepticism, and I can hear that sort of skeptic voice in the back of my mind.
That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's like, we see these patterns, and so of course it's just that this is just an invented story. But I think what when you really unpack what we're saying, it's like, no, it's actually revealing the fact that it couldn't possibly be an invented story. I mean, it's the story that God is writing. It's the story of God's history, or His intervention in human history, and so that's why, in a way, it's like this cycling back. Or I need to figure out what is this shape called, and maybe I could Google it really quick. But you know what? It's the spiral pattern. I think you mentioned it. It's like as you zoom in, you see more little spiral patterns. To me,
the fractal.
Is that just a fractal? Yeah.
Well,
it's like
the one you're thinking of is it's called a Mandelbrot sequence.
Okay,
which is in particular, it's named after the guy that discovered it. He was working for IBM back in the 60s. He noticed that there was an electrical interference, and it made a little pattern. But every time he zoomed in, the same pattern was occurring at smaller and smaller iterations. And so, he was kind of there's been awareness of these patterns, repeated layer patterns, in art for centuries. Yeah. But he was the one that said, this is actually due to an algorithm, which is if you put a number into an equation, and then the result that comes out the other end, you put back into the front again, and it just keeps iterating. And that's the one where you keep zooming and you just see the same thing over and over. So we have similar ideas and structures in our literature and music, etc. But just the complexity of this, it's like I remember reading something about the Shroud of Turin, and I've always been skeptical about it. But the evidence that I was reading, I thought, this isn't the kind of, I'm still undecided. This is the stuff that they brought out is not the kind of stuff that you would fake, especially for so many hundreds of years, like pollens from Jerusalem at the exact time of year, things like this. So, but with the Bible, it's like these are not the kinds of things that, and especially to the depth that someone would have the capacity or the time to think about. And so, it does vindicate its authenticity.
So, and Justin, is this kind of to your point that in a way interacting with the Bible story, and I guess maybe I should I should say that like when I say story, I'm not talking about a made up non-true thing. I'm talking about Martin Shaw, who I've just sort of recently found. He talked about myth as sacred story, you know, and that the story actually tells you more truth than just the facts of the matter, you know. And so this sense that the Bible as a story is sort of like you interact with it at different times, and it sort of reveals something different to you. You know, you've a lot of people have experienced this. You read through the same passage, and then you read through that same passage a year later, and you're like, wow, how did I not see that 2 years ago? You know, and it's just, it hit you at a different time or different way or whatever. But it's the nature of the biblical story is that you can kind of zoom in like that structure. So is that kind of what you're thinking as far as like just it being somewhat overwhelming?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's I think what you'll find is that the stories that you'd put in a movie or, you know, something is going to be it's going to take very, very small pieces of that bigger pattern and explore it, those smaller pieces, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, would it be helpful, Michael, if you just told us this pattern that you're talking about in terms of the sequence of feasts that you find over and over in the Bible, to kind of give us do you think you can summarize it?
I think so. Can I use Star Wars?
Yeah.
Please
I mean,
do.
yeah. I won't do that. I just thought it was funny that because that pattern of that pattern is the basic hero's journey, which means it's in so many things that we are familiar with, and so I there are 7 steps in what I call the conquest pattern, and you can see it in the first 7 books of the Bible. So the first thing is the first step I call creation, and Genesis is basically where Israel came from. That's the begin. In a sense, that's the beginning of the workday. Exodus is when you go to work. That's when God gives Israel a job to do. Leviticus is when you get to work and your boss tells you what he wants you to do. Okay, so it's just a list of here's the job, and as that's the priestly step. And the priest didn't have to think; they just had to obey. They're like servants. It's just do this, do that, whatever. They don't necessarily know what's going on. Like Jesus said, you know, you were servants, and I just told you what to do. Now you're my friends. You're actually the guests at the table, and you're in on my plans. That's what friend means. Herod and Pilate became friends. They're in on each other's plans. So that's Leviticus is the priestly step. Numbers, I call that ascension, because that's when you sort of come and stand before God and he tells you, you know, what to do. So creation is the beginning of the day, Genesis. Division is when you are separated, and that's where Israel was separated from the world, from the nations, from Egypt, and taken out to be with God. Leviticus is ascension. So creation, division, ascension. Testing is the central point we talk about chiasms, which is the V-shaped kind of thing. And testing is the bit in the middle. It's like the central point of an hourglass. You know, it's the chicane on the racetrack, the little tight spot you've got to get through. And so, you know, that's it, in the story of Adam in the garden. The testing was obviously where he was. You know, they were confronted by the serpent, and they had to choose between what the serpent was saying and what God had actually said, and try and figure it out. It wasn't simple, because the devil doesn't just come and give you an outright lie. He mixes it with truth, and that's what we're facing in a lot of these things that with cultural stuff we've got going on today. So test is the central point. The next step is maturity, and that's got the idea of multiplication. It's a multiplication of what you did when you were tested. So so Numbers was testing. That's when Israel blew it, and the old generation was cut off. And Numbers is a book that's full of snakes, you know, of various kinds. Maturity is the new generation of Israel, and they're mustered, they're gathered. So the idea of maturity is of like a swarm or a host, like a flock of birds or a school of fish that moves as one, even though it's many. It's got one mind, and that's the result. But so it's but the negative side of this, as we said, if you do the wrong thing at testing, the result at maturity is plagues, which are also a swarm, and that's where you have plagues of locusts and frogs and all this kind of thing. So step 5 is sort of the multiplication, positive or negative. I like to say plunder or plagues, which then you see the Philistines who actually make rats and boils out of gold. So that was plagues made out of plunder. So that's step 5 is maturity. Then number 6 is conquest, which is the Day of Atonement step, which is in movies it's kind of like the final battle, the one where the final confrontation with the enemy. That's conquest. And then the last step is glorification, which in Star Wars is the bit when they get their awards and there's a big ceremony at the end. It's always about the future. It's like the first step. It's either riding off into the sunset or, the happy couple they live happily ever after, that sort of thing. But what's interesting is in the biblical pattern, if someone does the wrong thing at testing, then there's plagues at maturity. At conquest, God comes and judges them, and very often the final step is missing. There's no step 7. It actually cuts it off after day 6, and so there's no rest. There's no Sabbath at the end. So in the feast pattern, you've got Sabbath, which is to do with creation, which is Adam on day 7, in the first week of history. Division, Exodus, that's Passover, which is the second one listed. Leviticus is first fruits, and that's what the Levites actually were. They were kind of like the first taste of things, and they were taken from the land. They didn't inherit any land because they themselves were the first fruits. This is working also through Genesis 1, where you've got light as creation, the division of waters as Exodus. There it is again, day 2. Day 3 is the dry land and the first plants made, which is the first fruits. Pentecost is the 4th one, which is testing, and that's the first Pentecost is when God gave Israel the law, and so it's the kingly step. It's like, right, am I going to walk by the light of the law, like David talks about the lamp of the law, and that's the testing step. Am I going to do what God said? I'm in the dark here. All I've got to go on is what God said. What I see around me isn't aligning with that. Do I go with what I heard or with what I see? And that's the test. In the first century, the test was the day of Pentecost. In that sense, you either received the Spirit or you rejected him. And the test then was, do I stick with the Jerusalem I can see, or do I believe that that's going to be destroyed and that there's a spiritual Jerusalem? And that was a tough test. That's why the book of Hebrews was written, because Jewish Christians were being persecuted, and they were apostatizing. That's what the apostasy was. It wasn't back into sin so much as back into Judaism. That was the apostasy. They'd been enlightened, but now they'd gone back to the old order, and yet that was going to pass away. So that's Pentecost. Trumpets is kind of like the warning, like. It's at Jericho, it was going around the city blowing trumpets as the warning. In Revelation, it's the trumpets that are warning that the city is going to be destroyed. As someone pointed out, Jericho as a city was circumcised. They went around it and cut down the walls. It was cut around, literally cut around. And the Israelites were circumcised again just before they did that, because no one had been circumcised who was born in the wilderness. God said, I'm going to circumcise Israel a second time. And then they circumcised the city. So in the first century, you have the circumcision is actually the death of the apostles and the Christians, the Jewish Christians who were massacred. And then the Romans actually cut around, they put a trench and a wall around Jerusalem. And then that's the destruction of the city. So that's the conquest step. That's blowing up the Death Star. And so, as I like to say, people say, well, Jesus was a pacifist. I'm like, no. Jesus, like Obi-Wan, knew when to put down his lightsaber and be killed. There's a time to do that. But he also knew when to blow up the Death Star. And, and everyone in it. That's like Jericho. That's like, well, you guys are all Egypt. You've had enough warnings. God has been very patient. he's actually been patient so that more and more people would actually believe during that time. And so that's the big Day of Atonement. So just as the veil in the temple was torn when Jesus died, so now the whole temple was going to be torn down. It was the same pattern working over a bigger time, longer time. And then then you've got the celebration at the end where the saints have been avenged, and then it moves into there's a glimpse of the future. So the inheritance at the end, it's like, here's the prize. I mean, it'd be good if I could hold up some charts, but we know the pattern because it's built into us already from all the things that we watch.
So, but I'm going to do this really annoying thing because I followed your illustration for the first 6 books. So you got me all the way up to Joshua.
Yeah.
But you said 7, right? So was Judges the fact that there was no feast. There was no, because this is where sort of story
it was Adam again. It was the same thing.
Right. So they had to sort of restart, and Judges was this judgment. There was no wedding feast. There was judgment.
Yeah. Well, as I like to say, the priesthood had failed, which is the same thing that Adam did. He seized the kingdom in a sense. They rejected God as their king. That's what they did. They had no king, but they rejected God as their king, and each of them was doing what was right in his own eyes. They weren't obeying God's law. But God did raise up judges as champions, and I like to say they're kind of celebrity pastors. They just people criticize celebrity pastors, and they're all very flawed people, and so are the judges. But when God raises up someone who's a really good preacher, and they change the landscape. And there's been a few people who've sort of blown it a bit later on, or they end up being human. That's the thing. And I won't mention any names because we don't need that sort of controversy. But
No.
but at the same time, God gifted them to do something that changed the landscape. And that's so Judges, it's a mix of success and failure. It ends in failure, but that is day 7. And the book of Revelation follows this pattern exactly. And at the end, the last sequence begins with John seeing the saints sitting on thrones as judges. That's why Jesus said, Paul said, you will judge angels. These people they were sitting on 12 thrones, well, the apostles were. And so you've got this idea of entering into God's rest, which is sitting on a throne. Right. That is the kind of rest. Because you've come through the pattern, you've obeyed God, then you've overcome. That's the conquest step. And then the final one is, you are now seated with me, ruling with me in my kingdom. Yeah. Because the first table is like the Last Supper. Right. The last table is the table in heaven.
That's what's fascinating to me about the book of Revelation, and maybe some of my sort of wrestling with it is that because the pattern, because there's patterns there, because it's very sort of cyclical, and there's all these things that you can kind of they can kind of trigger that, like awareness that there's a pattern, that there's a rhythm to the book. Again, we sort of lose the story, and what I've always found is that it is an apocalypse. It's a very like intense judgment, but it's an encouragement to you if you are a believer. Like ultimately, that was always what I got from the book of Revelation, and I needed, I'm continuing to study it, but there was this, it's rest. It is that you are brought back into harmony with the Creator. Now, of course, there's a judgment, so there is that, and we like to kind of, I don't know, maybe because it's so dramatic, that's the thing that pulls our attention in, and we forget that, like, in a way, like I really get the sense that it's an encouragement. It's an encouragement to go through sort of the trials and tribulations because there is that rest.
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear that there's goodies and baddies, and
Yeah.
the goodies win in the end, which
Yeah.
is that's the basic story. Even if you've got no idea when there are people who they have a position called idealism, which they say, look, it's not actually talking about any particular era in history.
Right.
It's an idealistic vision that can be applied at any time. And I agree with the idea that it can be applied at any time, because all scripture is like that. But to get the correct application, you have to interpret it first.
Right.
And that's where I say, well, look, you're going with the application here, but you've skipped the interpretation. And that if you just have an idealistic view of it, you can't make sense of the details. There's so many details there that they're very specific, and you just have to kind of, just look at it from a distance and through frosted glass. I'm like, yeah, I get the general picture, but once for me, it was like once I realized that the details are kind of like they're all, as you mentioned, they're all from the Old Testament, and it's like meme warfare. Like it's the same. It's picking up images from the Old Testament and saying, hey, remember that? Remember that incident there? It's kind of happening again. In a spiritual sense, remember how that turned out? And so it's the same picture with just a bit of a different caption each time. And some of these images have got a long history throughout the Bible, like you mentioned, coverings.
Yeah.
So
I want to see if I can find something. This may make noise, so I apologize. I tried to find this picture before our conversation, and I cannot seem to find it. I think it's actually on a different computer. But there was a drawing that I found. I can link this in the description of the video after we post it. But it's Dr. Chip Bennett's YouTube channel. He's talking about the Book of Revelation. I could have sworn there was a drawing here, and he's showing. He had a Google Drive link, and I thought I downloaded it, so I thought it was on my Google Drive, but maybe I was on a different. You can just describe
it.
Well, it's very hard to that's the thing. You're like, oh man, you want to describe it, but how to do that? He's connecting. Well, one of the things that he does is he connects the Book of Revelation to John's Gospel. Okay, so that's one thing, which is helpful. But he also connects it to the book of Joshua, which I thought was interesting as you were going through kind of this pattern, this idea that, so in that pattern, what would the book of Joshua represent? Can you take me back there really quick?
Well, that's blowing up the Death Star. That's step 6.
Yeah, it's
conquest. In the feast pattern, it's the Day of Atonement, which is the high priest, in a sense, would atone for the sins of the nation, and symbolically, when he came out of the Holy of Holies again, he would be walking out into a new world, a new heaven and a new earth, which has now been washed clean of sin. And so, but the same pattern is in the history from Adam to Noah, where obviously the flood is the day of coverings. Everyone gets covered. And Noah actually walks out of the ark into a new world. He's inherited the earth.
And he plants a garden.
So that's the big Day of Atonement there. So all of the judgment that God had postponed, he let Adam off the hook. He let Cain off the hook, the sons of God off the hook. But then now Noah himself, his ministry is the trumpets. He's preaching and warning. That's the trumpet section. And then you've got the judgment. The Joshua step is the flood. And then God makes a new covenant with Noah, and Noah rests. Noah's name means rest, or bringer of rest.
Rest and comfort.
So,
okay.
So that's the pattern there. Revelation, there's a lot of Joshua stuff, but it's really in step 6 of the book.
Here, actually, there's a video of this. So I was looking for the drawing, but there's actually a video. Where is it? Let me see if I can just play this. You guys might be fascinated by it. But, you had mentioned the chiasm, and I don't know. Oh, okay. It's like a couple minutes long. Let's see if I can do this. I'm kind of on the fly. I almost sent this to you guys in on X. I guess I won't dead name Twitter. I'll respect its preferred title there, as much as it's a weird one. Calling it X.
Call it Twitter.
Well, okay. So here's a thought. I never like things that reduce us down to bestial forms. So if it's Twitter and I tweet, then I'm behaving like, a beast, and that's a de-evol. I just don't.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be a beast.
Yeah, okay.
I want to just post on X. I don't want to tweet on Twitter. Okay.
Oh.
Let's see if I do this.
Oh, that's Warren. Yes, I know Warren Gage.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. So we have something. Let's see. So this is the Revelation Project. Warren Gage and Chip Bennett did 3 days on the Book of Revelation. This is day 1, tying the Book of Revelation to the Book of Joshua, which is really interesting because we lose this in translation, that Jesus' name is Yeshua. This is Jesus'. Joshua is Jesus' name, and the Book of Joshua is really helpful in if we're gonna make sense of what we're seeing in the Book of Revelation. I do think obviously the Old Testament helps us because have you read the book, John? Is it just Old Testament use? Beale wrote a book, Old Testament.
Yep.
Yeah.
The title is
Uses
escaping
of
me.
the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah. Okay.
Something.
Yeah. And so he's drawing on it, and I think, Justin, this is kind of what you were talking about. It's like you could take a small little piece of this, and you could really just you could zoom in. And that's one of the things that I think we're doing. Is the Book of Joshua the key for understanding the Book of Revelation? No, but it's helpful. Just like if you read the Old Testament and understand what Revelation is doing, all of these stories are going to be helpful. So let me see if I can get this to play. If you guys can hear it, let me know. And I just think it'll be fascinating to get your feedback on this.
Once again, reinforce the power of the narrative of what's going on in the Book of Revelation. So let's look here as a congregation.
Names of the heroes of the Bible God could have chosen. He chose to give his son Jesus, the Hebrew name Joshua or Yeshua, which becomes Jesus in Greek. You see, after Moses died, Joshua led God's people into their earthly inheritance in the Promised Land by triumphing at the Battle of Jericho. But Jesus came as a greater Joshua who was destined to lead God's people into their heavenly inheritance in the heavenly New Jerusalem by triumphing in an even greater battle, the Battle of Revelation. To understand how Jesus will win that battle, though, we first have to understand the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Jericho was a wicked city, walled up to heaven against God, that Joshua had to conquer so that God's people could come into their earthly inheritance. It was a city filled with gold, silver, and a Babylonian garnet. And in it lived a woman of shame, identified by her linen and scarlet, Rahab, who had come to saving faith. Before the battle, Joshua sent 2 spies into the city, who were delivered from death after 3 days. Then, after Israel crossed the Jordan River, Joshua built a memorial of 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel, and purified the people for holy war by reinstituting circumcision and the Passover feast. The commander of the hosts of the Lord came to declare the battle, armed with a sword, and Joshua fell before him at his feet. Joshua then conducted the battle with a series of telescopic sevens. Israel marched around the city with the Ark of the Covenant for 7 days. On the 7th day, they marched 7 times. On the 7th time around the city, they sounded 7 trumpets. At the sounding of the 7th trumpet, all Israel shouted, and the great city fell.
Okay, so that's that pattern, right? That's that you zoom in, it's that...
But before Jericho was burned, Joshua commanded Rahab and her family to come out of the wicked city.
And
we
we're
get an
back
ad.
to third quarter planning. Adams is quarterbacking
Free
this
ads,
project.
everybody.
Rahab was delivered from death and became a royal bride in the line of Christ. Does the Battle of Jericho foretell the Battle of Revelation? Like Jericho, Babylon is a wicked and mysterious city, walled up to heaven against God, that Jesus must conquer so that God's people can come
That looks
into their
like
heavenly
Herod's temple.
inheritance. We aren't told the city's real name, only that it has become spiritually corrupt like Sodom in Egypt, and that it is where the Lord Jesus was crucified. Like Jericho, it is a city filled with gold, silver, and Babylonian garments. And in it lives a mysterious woman of shame, identified by her linen and scarlet. The Lord Jesus comes to declare the battle, armed with a sword, and the Apostle John falls before him at his feet. Next, like Joshua, Jesus purifies the people for holy war by calling the 7 churches to repentance, and sends 2 witnesses into the city, who are delivered from death after 3 days. Like Joshua, Jesus then conducts the battle with a series of telescopic sevens. The 7 seals are opened. When the 7th seal is opened, it becomes 7 trumpets. When the 7th trumpet sounds, it becomes 7 bowls of judgment poured out on the wicked city. After the sounding of the 7th trumpet, all of heaven shouts. The Ark of the Covenant is revealed in heaven, and the great city falls, not one stone remaining upon another. But before Babylon is burned, Jesus says to the wicked city, "Come out of her, my people." The people of God, whose sins were like scarlet, but have been made white as snow, are delivered from death to become the royal bride of Christ. Finally, after crossing the river of crystal waters, Jesus leads his people to a golden city built on a foundation of 12 precious gemstones, representing the 12 apostles to the nations. It's the garden city of the heavenly New Jerusalem, where Jesus will welcome all of us into our promised inheritance as his eternal bride.
Okay, so and I sped it up to, respect their own creative property there. So if that's annoying, I'm sorry, but that's the world we live in.
That's okay. They were talking a bit slowly anyway.
Yeah. Well, and so for me, here's the key too. It's like pattern, a clue. I observe the clue, I establish the pattern, and then there's this point of contact. And for me, you're realizing that, God's people are that unfaithful woman that he is drawing out of the city. And sorry, I'm getting distracted here because I decided I wanted to stop sharing this screen because it's annoying me midway through my sentence, which is a bad idea. So that's where the point of contact is. It's Rahab. It's the harlot. It's restore. It's the woman who is unfaithful becomes the bride. That's the story. So the clue, pattern, contact. It's like it brought us to the story, and I don't know. I think that's where I sort of come in. It's like I love that the clues are there, that the pattern is there, that it's showing me that God is sort of in control of this thing. Really, that He's the hero of the story, and I don't have to be. And then what it causes me to realize is, oh, that's me. That's me. And that's why the book of Revelation is actually a great encouragement, because you're freed from the destruction of the city, and though you were an unfaithful bride, you are an unfaithful woman, you become the bride of Christ. That to me is a glorious sort of story about the goodness of God, His redemption, His love, and the victory that we have in Him. Because if it were not for Him, I would be lost in my unfaithfulness. I'd be stuck there. I would. Who's going to free me from this? It takes the bridegroom coming and conquering, and again, the city falls. Right. That's the going back to kind of like, if I'm trying to save myself, or I'm trying to wall up those things that make me vulnerable. Nope, He's going to remove that, and He's going to take away your need for that protection. You're going to enter into His rest and his protection. You know, does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
So
So
I
did
thought that was cool. Yeah.
Did that little animation fit your pattern, Michael?
Well, it follows the biblical story, so yeah. I mean, it's. I think one thing that struck me with Jordan's take was, you know, he says, because it is the same pattern as the Garden of Eden, but the Garden of Eden was about individuals. You got Adam, Eve, and the serpent. But in Revelation, you've got the false prophet, the harlot, and the beast. But they're institutions in a sense. They're corporate. They're not. You know, the false prophet is more about a corporate lie. All of the false prophets, those who lie for the establishment. You know, we have a lot of that going on now, especially over the last few years.
Right. Well, and the woman becomes the community of the church, becomes the bride.
Yeah,
right?
she's deceived in that way. She's kind of like the corporate. She's the people that have been lied to by, I don't know, the feds, if they're listening, big pharma, I don't know, you know. But in spiritual terms, in the first century, it was the lie that Jerusalem was the great city, and that God still favored, God was still in the old order. That was the challenge. And then, of course, the serpent becomes the beast. It's not just a lie. And as Justin and I think discussed was, you know, if the serpent comes first, the first thing that comes is a lie. If you don't deal with the lie, then it grows legs in a sense and becomes a dragon. And that's so the lie in the garden leads to bloodshed in the land. It's Cain. So there's a dragon. And then if you don't deal with the dragon, then it becomes all the nations, and it's a sea beast. And a sea beast doesn't tear you apart. It just swallows you whole. Like it's just this enormous, that's globalism. Okay. So that's it. It's so big that everyone's now kind of a part of it. But so in Revelation, it's actually the same conspiracy as in the Garden of Eden, but it's now culture wide.
Yeah.
And Jordan points out that the reason that Jesus deals with the 7 churches at the start, he says, you've got a Jezebel you need to deal with in your church. Let me show you what happens when you don't deal with the Jezebel in your church. Your whole culture becomes a harlot. You've got a Balaam in your church. Deal with him. Otherwise, your whole culture will become a false prophet. This is the full-grown version of those sins, and Jesus is purifying those churches so that they can testify against, you know, the great city. So, so the idea then is it's not, Revelation's not just about me as an individual. It is the same story, but it's corporate.
Yeah.
I think that's really
and the you know, the serpent in chapter 3 of Genesis is a beast. This is why I said I didn't want to tweet things anymore, right? No, but the serpent is that beast, and then I always thought it connected to this with God and Cain. Sin is, but if you do not do well, sin is crouching. Sin's crouching at your door, and it desires for you, but you must master it. So sin is a beast-like thing crouching at the door of Cain, waiting to devour him. And then, you know, in a way that to me takes us to the Tower of Babel. It's like, what were they trying to do? So to your point, Michael, it's like sin is spreading and becoming corporate, but it's also going to reveal the true victory of Jesus, because this beast here, if that's right, if this is a sort of if sin sort of kind of becomes this beast that's crouching at your door, you have to master it, and then you have to ask Yahweh, well, how do I master it? Because it's too big for me, is the beast that shows up in the book of Revelation. It's just so massive. No one can conquer the beast except the Lamb.
Yeah, what Jordan brings out is the fact that you know, that God brought the animals to Adam, then he brought the animals, the beasts, to Noah. The idea that, and then of course the nations come to represent social versions of these beasts. The idea is that if the man is faithful, the nations will bow down to him. But the reason that the beast in Revelation happens is because of the unfaithfulness of the Jews. The idea is that if you're faithful, God, the Gentiles will convert. Nebuchadnezzar was converted. by the ministry, indirectly by the ministry of Daniel. Pharaoh was converted by Joseph. As when Solomon started, God subdued the nations around him and gave him peace. And so the idea, Revelation, the reason that that Rome rises up as a beast is because of the unfaithfulness of the Jews. If they'd been dealing with the lie, if they'd been teaching the truth, then Rome would have been conquered spiritually instead of coming as an enemy. And so the idea is that the beasts are to be subdued. I mean, in a sense, they're put under the man's feet of God,
right,
if he's faithful. But if the man's unfaithful, then he has to fight them.
Right. Yeah, you're left on your own. Yeah, you have to do your own protecting of yourself against this beast. Now, I'm noticing that Justin's lighting is changing, and I know that we're coming up on an hour. And I know we didn't necessarily discuss this, but I had figured that, I didn't want to take up too much of your guys' time, and I thought that maybe an hour would be a good sort of check-in point, kind of stopping point for now, or putting a pin in it a little bit.
It all depends on the battery in Justin's fancy camera.
Yeah.
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
I could see there might be something that I could give you guys that we could maybe wrap up on if you want, which is something similar to what you guys have been saying. Which is I took, Michael, our last conversation in a couple of your books, and I came up with a little Monstrology, following this pattern, but way simple, way more simple than the sevenfold pattern. It's just 3. And it's basically just snake, beast, Leviathan, priest.
I saw that. Yes. Well, it's there's an article by a friend who's in the Theopolis group called Remy Wilkins, and it's called Serpents First. And he's drawing on James Jordan again. It is basically the garden land world pattern and the different beasts that are in there. And the fact that you have come up with that independently is a vindication of that exact thing.
That it's there. Yeah,
there it is. Yeah.
What do you guys think? Because
I like
to
Monstrology.
me,
That's a good word.
That is good. I like that. Yeah, Monstrology fits well with mythology. We're just going down these roads, and it's like C.S. Lewis. It's the myth made fact. It's just that all the it's like the fairy tales are coming true. Because they're based off of the true myth. And I you interact on X, and people, I posted something about giants in the book of Genesis, and like, well, there wasn't really giants walking around. I'm like, were there not? Why wouldn't there be? Just because it's like we're modern and we think we've got it all figured out. It's like they're like dinosaurs were real. Like that's So just if you start thinking about that, then the possibilities kind of open up. But no, I think that's good. I wanted you guys to kind of share some of your projects, and again, I do appreciate the time. I feel like these are ongoing conversations. When I started this podcast, I was always initially discouraged by the fact that I always felt like there was more to be said, and that I couldn't put everything in one episode. And then I realized, well, we just have to do more. We have to do more thinking and more dialogue and more discussion on these topics, because, and again, ultimately I'll put a bow, at least in my thinking, on the book of Revelation and this Monstrology, because one of the things that I'm confronting, and maybe this is because I have inherited sort of, my first church that I went to when I became a Christian, kind of convinced me that sin was not a big deal. It's hamartia, it's missing the mark. It's just missing the mark. That's how it was said to me. It's like sin is just missing the mark. And I think that was to make the idea of sin accessible to people who might be overly sensitive to conviction. It's like, well, we don't want to scare anybody away by getting too down and dirty about our sin. But when you start to look at what Jesus is conquering in the book of Revelation, the beast that is sort of crouching at the door of Cain, that needs mastering, I realize that I just desperately need the victory of Jesus to save me from a terrible, horrific beast that I am in some ways very much tied to because of my own disobedience. I think that that's why God scattered the people at the Tower of Babel. They were creating something in their disobedience that was just a true horror. And God, because he's merciful, was like, hey, you know what? You guys, we need to split up this power because you're meddling in things that ought not to be meddled in. Now, there's a time and place where he eventually, I think, conquers what ultimately we as humanity are doing in rebellion to him. We're sort of creating these horrific things that are too strong for us, that are too powerful for us. And so for me, I think back to Rahab. I think back to just the fact that God is sort of purifying his people, and we all live in disobedience. But what does that look like? And if I realize, if I stop and I think that sin is crouching at my door and it must be mastered, I have to master it. Well, I can't. I desperately need Christ. That's for me. I guess that's both the conviction and the great comfort that I receive from going through this, sort of tying this pattern into the book of Revelation.
Just one thing I'd like to share is the idea of the Monstrology, with the first thing is the serpent. It seems that even if you get to the point where you failed to deal with the serpent's lie, you're in land, and there's now conflict in the land between brothers, and then you end up at the Leviathan step. God's solution is not to tackle the Leviathan directly; it's to tackle the lie. And I don't know if something that struck me was the movie Ender's Game, which was based on the novels, but they had this huge swarm of alien spacecraft, and there's one guy who supposedly attacked the central ship. When he blew that up, all of the other ones were deactivated.
Right.
And it's the idea that everything in the world has a head and a body, and the body is the swarm. And so if you deal with the lie at the center, the controlling mechanism, and that's why Jesus on the cross deals with the lie. He changed the powers. And I think for me, it's the same with Cain. If Cain didn't master the beast, he would become the door that would actually let that beast into the world.
Right.
Jesus says, "I am the door," because he's dealing with the lie. And so, by one man's sin, death entered into the world. So the idea is, God's like, well, look, you don't have to actually fight all the armies. You don't have to defeat Leviathan. You just have to go back to that little lie that is the entrance. That's the portal through which this comes into the world.
Yeah.
If you don't master that, you become the portal by which it comes into the world. But if you deal with the lie, and I think that's what we're seeing now with the idea of controlling information and everything, because it's just the voice of the apostles saying, here's the truth, and that deconstructs their whole system, right. Their whole, it pulls it apart. So in a sense, all we have to do is to stand fast on the truth. That is the spiritual battle. We just have to deal with the snake. That the snake's always the one at the center.
Yeah.
I think that's the key.
Yeah, I think that's great because again in the book of Revelation, it is that people are being deceived, and I think a lot of people are concerned about that, and yet Jesus says, "Hey, it's actually to your benefit that I go, because I'm going to send to you the Holy Spirit, and He is going to lead you into all truth." So it's like, okay, again, the people of God are sort of, okay, I can be at peace. I can be at peace. If I, in a sense, trust that. Yeah.
Well, you can see it in sports movies, And so like at the end of Hoosiers, they finally get to the Leviathan. And what does the coach say to all the kids in the locker room? He says, remember the fundamentals. you know. So like during the priestly portion of the movie, I'm applying your stuff to movies now, Mike.
Yeah.
So during the priestly portion, they learn the difference between the truth and the lie. In the context of that movie, it's shoot now versus pass 4 times before you shoot. That's basically taking the fruit now versus planting the seed and waiting for the thing to grow. That's to me, that's the basic difference between the two ways. Is one is I want to take the fruit now, the glory now. The other one is plant the seed, wait for it to water it, wait for it to grow, and then the fruit will come. That's the natural pattern. There's always a circumvention of it, you know.
Yeah.
So basically, they learned that in the priestly part. So he had to kick out the snake. Then he had to subjugate the beast by training the players and benching the one guy who wanted to shoot before he passed it 4 times. Then they finally get to the world portion where they're going out to the world. They're facing the Leviathan, the big bad state championship. And that's the one thing, that's how you defeat the Leviathan, is you take that thing that you learned during the priestly part that you've now internalized and you plant in the Leviathan. And then rather than the Leviathan eating you, the Leviathan gets eaten from the inside. So for example, the Apostle Paul, that's why he has to go across the waters and go to Rome and plant the Evangelion in the Roman Empire, which eventually ate it from the inside and turned it. If you go to Rome now, what you're going to see is
That's
that
I was
reminds
going
me
to
of
point
just one
that
thing
out
quickly.
earlier.
That reminds me of Pharaoh cutting off the male children of Israel, and then they would basically take the women. That's always kill Adam, take the bride, raise your own seed, basically. But then Moses, the basket, baby Moses, floating into Egypt like seed into a womb. That's like God's sense of humor. Is like, well, I'm going to use Egypt to raise its own destroyer, which is what you're saying, you know, which is, he has a very, very ironic sense of humor.
The irony, God is always in the business of using the weapons of the enemy to defeat the enemy, right? He kills death by death, you know, he ends death by dying. And I think like the point about Rome is actually great because it does like he does defeat Rome. He does he in a sense converts it from the inside, devours it from the inside.
Yeah,
you know,
it's transformation, not revolution.
Yes. And the funny thing is, and I don't remember where I got that. I actually got this from Michael Heiser, is that the feast, the wedding feast in the book of Revelation, the meal that's being cooked is the Leviathan. Now, I think he gets that from an extra biblical tradition, but that's the idea, is that the people of God are actually feasting on the Leviathan. So, Justin, I think you were touching on something there.
Everything's clean now. Everything's clean.
Right. Yeah. And so here's one thing, and not to, hopefully this doesn't open a whole nother thing, but is that the reason, and again, this is me talking to the skeptic in the back of my mind, I think the reason that we see these patterns and that they make sense, just like Justin was saying, in the movie Hoosiers, are people, is it because people are trying to copy these patterns everywhere, or is it happening more naturally and more organically? And I think what I see in Scripture is that it's part of God's revelatory process, is that it's not like John combed through the Old Testament and said, okay, let me craft this perfect sort of retelling of all of the Old Testament. He's certainly intentionally doing some of that. But I think it's so next level that it would require the mind of God to really put all of these things together. And we're just kind of going, oh my gosh, we see bits and pieces of it. But it's because we live in God's world, and God has structured the world this way, that you can see the pattern in the book of Revelation. You can see it in the movie Hoosiers. Like, you can see these things everywhere. But why? Because we live in God's world. It's the way God made the world. He's consistent in that. His revelation follows that.
On the organic level, you can see it on the organic level. It's also the pattern of how a tree works.
Right.
You know, I would say that it's basically the pattern of life.
Right.
Is what it is. That's just how the world works.
Yeah.
And this is revealing the pattern of life to you. So it's revelatory in that sense, but you can confirm it by, for example, when you see how a seed goes down into dirt and then gathers and eats the multiplicity around it, and then grows up into a tree.
Yeah.
Eats it from the inside. Logos is like a seed. It's like so it goes down. And the same thing is like, Christ is a seed. He gets planted and he comes up in the garden, literally planted in the earth, and then literally comes up into a garden. So it's a pattern. I would just say it's just the pattern of life, and that's why it works for story. It's again, it's a light. It's shining. So I can take that light and I say, oh, here's a pattern, and I can shine it on a tree, a real physical, actual tree in the world, and I can see the pattern. Oh, this is how the tree works. Now, it also applies to me because I'm like a tree. I'm living in this world, and I'm a life form, and so it's also the pattern of my life in some sense.
Well, and I think that we're in this world where I just touched on Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and the Emissary, and he's talking about, like, long story short, I'm reading it because of my work in youth ministry, and because what I'm seeing in youth is the effects of a life without story. They're looking at me and they're just like, just give me the facts. Just open, just give me the thing. What's the Bible telling me? What is it? What am I supposed to learn from it? It's like, well, let's pump the brakes for a second. You will learn from this as soon as you learn to read it for what it is.
Yeah. Yes.
So we have to go through that process first and recapture story and the importance of story in what Justin just said, because it's literally life. We're talking about life. We're not just talking about some made up fairy tale that has no application in life. We're talking about the thing that is like, we're living in a story. We're literally in a story right now. It just so happens that the author of this story is Creator God, Yahweh. He revealed himself through Scripture. And so we see these, and he's revealed himself in nature, but he's also revealed himself most profoundly in the person of Christ, which again, just sort of takes us back to the idea of story. Like, he's the hero, I'm not. That's where my peace is. That's where my rest is. I don't have to conquer that snake. He is the one who conquers the snake, and he's the one preparing that wedding feast. And he invites us in to that wedding feast. And it's, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but when you were talking, Justin, we're talking about John chapter 19, when Jesus resurrects, he's in a garden, which is why Mary thinks he's a gardener. Like, a lot of people miss that. It's like, oh, Mary thought he was a gardener. Why? Because he's in a garden. That's not an accident. The seed dies, goes into the ground just like he said it would, and then it starts to give life. And she thinks he's a gardener. Why? Because he is a gardener. He's the greatest gardener who ever gardened a garden.
I think I used to teach high school students the Bible at a local high school here. We still have that in a lot of government schools. We still have some Bible teaching. But teaching the kids to not only follow the story, and how one episode would lead to the next one, but also to look at the details. One thing about the Bible is that there's no detail there that is not there for a reason. Right. Like in a good movie, like, there's nothing that happens in a film that isn't there for a reason. Every little detail matters. But also the idea that, and once again, going back to Jordan, he's very foundational. It's not just story, but it's also architecture, song. God gives us all of these things because they resonate. It's not just, as you say, in the West, we've been trained to sort of like look at the text and say, okay, how can I distill this down, purify it in a sense of all the clutter and raw materials, and get it down to the essence and get that essential truth. And the idea is that God's given us grain and grapes, and we have to that's the raw material of the Bible. But he's actually given us bread and wine. Like he hasn't given us the raw material. This is the feast. The text itself is the finished product. We don't have to. I mean, we need to digest it. We need to explain it, and actually, there's still some work involved. But it's not the work of trying to cut away all of the sort of extraneous cultural material, or all of that actually speaks to us as well. And when we say, look, what's the moral of this story? It's like, you're missing the point in a sense. If you read the story of David and Bathsheba, it's like, oh well, David disobeyed God, so God took his killed the baby.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, the moral is don't disobey God. How do I apply that to me? And the point is that David behaved like Pharaoh, so God took his firstborn, but then gave him another son by the same woman. So, I think it's teaching them that it is the finished product, and that everything is there. But we think like scientists now, so
right. Yeah, and that's McGilchrist's point. It's sort of like this left brain, right brain thing, and I think that does take us back to actually model and story, because it's like this idea of, and both are important, and both need to work together, and we need to pull them together and not be one or the other. I think is McGilchrist's point. I haven't got all the way through the book. I'm like not even close to getting all the way through the book. So. But okay,
so
it is like
that the other Jordan says, you've been talking about Jordan, James Jordan, but Jordan Peterson is, when you internalize a story, it's like eating. It's like you have to internalize it and digest it, and so what you learn from a story is not exactly clear to your conscious mind. So there's a sense that we interact with stories from early on as children and on up, and those stories will kind of feed you in a way.
Yeah.
And so that's not distilled down to like a lesson, and like here's the lesson. Rather, what it is it's this kind of like participatory entering into, like kind of interacting with imaginatively, creatively, with this story, and then the story will kind of like go underneath your decision-making process in a way, to the point where, and there's a lot of brain science and stuff now that says like your decisions are kind of almost pre-conscious anyway, and so that you're really working on that level, which might be the other side of the brain than what we're used to working on, or something like. But that's kind of what's going on, I think. And so that's why I think you get super fans of Star Wars, super fans of Lord of the Rings, that are way more kind of like excited than you see a typical super fan of the Bible. Excited for the actual story, and not really kind of like rushing to a conclusion. And so therefore, here's what we think about it. Therefore, it's kind of just like, I just love this story, and I like this part of the story, I like that part of the story, and it kind of it's something that grows within you.
Yeah, I'm playing with the idea. And I'm really bad at remembering chapter and verse. I'm really bad at remembering addresses and dates and times and stuff like that. But you are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works that he has prepared beforehand. Okay, so that word poema, the workmanship word, it does have that. And I'm working with this, but it is the idea that when we interact with a story, we behold that story in our imagination or somewhere. So it moves from sort of one space in the hierarchy of being, ink and paper, let's say, two-dimensional ink and paper. But as I read it, it goes into my subconscious, conscious, whatever, wherever the imagination is. And
are you saying the word becomes flesh?
Oh yeah, and so it's embodied. It's embodied because as I behold, I become, right? This is mimetic transformation. This is how we learn to talk and walk and everything else. We see it, and then we become that, or we imitate, or and so that's what's happening. I mean, I think most profoundly it's happening with the Word of God because it's living and active. But
that comes back to the lie as well, because the idea of dealing with the serpent is not allowing that false word to become flesh. Right. It's cutting it off, right? It's no, sorry, that's wrong. So
because and lies about, man, I mean we could go down that, lies about myself. If I'm convinced that and this is my whole thing about the beast. If my story is a story that I evolved from, matter to plant, to whatever, some beast, then you can treat me like a beast and I won't fight back. But if my story is, no, God thought of me and created me for a purpose, and you are perverting that purpose, I'm going to reject that. So I am going to fight back. But if that lie can be implanted in my mind that, oh, well, since I'm just a beast anyway, when somebody treats me like a beast, it sort of feels consistent.
Yep.
Well, if you're a beast anyway, then you might as well sell your birthright for a bowl of soup. Right.
That's right.
You have different priorities.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's, like if you give food to a dog and you say, okay, I'm going to give you 7 days worth of food here, only eat one per day. The dog won't do it. The dog will eat all 7 right at once. Right. And so there's a sense that the human has the long view and knows how to sacrifice the present for the future.
Yeah.
And so you can rise above the level of the beast.
Yeah.
In virtue of just a higher level of maturity and a higher level of, let's say, perspective.
Yeah. Someone I mentioned on Twitter, sorry, X, where they're talking about what the flesh means and to be carnal. And I think it's the idea of we all have God-given appetites, but it's the idea of obviously mastering them, as God said to Cain, you have to master this. But then it's almost like human beings are like horses that need to be broken in. There's all of this potential and strength and desire and appetites and all these things. But we're called to subdue the earth, but the first thing we have to subdue is ourselves. That's the Jordan's clean your room. Start there. This is your first victory, is making the bed. But self-government, in the sense that the test in Eden was, Adam, if you're going to govern the world, you first have to govern yourself. It's the marshmallow test, as you say, with the dog and food. It's like, look, but it's like if you eat the marshmallow, if you don't eat the marshmallow, I'll come back and you can have 2. But with God, it's like, well, I'll come back and He gives you the whole bag. It's like, yep, you did it. Here you go. That's where His generosity is. But the lie there is that Satan's lie is that God is stingy. That's why He doesn't want you to have this. Whereas
He doesn't want you to know. He doesn't want you to know what He knows.
Yeah, but I think talking about story, and especially with talking as a youth pastor, that kids' minds, especially teenagers, they're open and they're asking questions, and when you can speak to them they're more and more visual thinkers in a sense. They're more in tune with that sort of thing. They're actually a lot more open to this kind of thinking than older Christians who have been trained a certain way and find it difficult. But there's been a few times when I've been talking to some older people and making visual connections, and you can just see the lights going up. We can do that, can we? We can do that. Yes, you can. Like with the gardener, it's like it's plant and payoff. It's the Hollywood. What's his name? McGee, I think.
Robert
talking
McGee,
about plant and payoff. Where if there's a payoff in a story, but there was no hint of it before, you feel ripped off. It's like, well, that's just a magic trick now, but it's still a magic trick. But you planted a seed, and that then vindicated later on. So I think God does that all the time, and that's why I think Revelation is kind of like the full-grown tree with all the fruit, but you can see the seeds of all of that planted back throughout biblical history, and now this is the finished product. But you can only understand the finished product with all of that sort of prior instruction, and I think it's for young people especially. That's where video comes in and storytelling, film. But importantly, teaching people how to read the Bible to read it visually, because there's a lot of things you're not going to get unless you're actually imagining what's happening.
Right, and you're exactly right. It's like we haven't given people permission to engage the imagination. We've given them permission to engage the mind, but have we given them permission to engage the imagination when it comes to reading these stories, reading the Bible in particular? And I do think what I see sometimes is we sort of abandon story because it's maybe less convenient. Model is a little bit easier for me to just sort of give that to you. And I experienced this recently, listening to another youth pastor teach at a conference, And I just thought, he's doing a really good job. He's got a really good outline. Like, this outline is really good. But there's no story. He kept telling stories about his own life and like inserting them into the outline. And I'm like, but it was so funny because he would get all animated when he would tell these stories about his life or whatever. And then it would kind of like apply to what he was talking about. But then when we went through sort of the scripture, it kind of got lost. It was like mumbly and there was less animation. And it was like he had to get, through the outline rather than just tell a story. And it left me thinking like, man, you should have just told a story. I mean, you should just tell the Bible story. And it was from an epistle. And so it's like, okay, I get that that's maybe lends to kind of the outline a little bit better. But in a way, and again, this is stuff that I'm working through. I don't have this really figured out, but it does seem like we need to recapture story. We need to realize that it's not convenient. It's going to take time. Oftentimes it's going to unfold over a matter of, I don't know, maybe hours, let's say. But then it's going to feed you almost perpetually. We talked about that earlier with the Bible. It's near infinite in its ability to.
But you can't eat a meal all at once. You have to eat it in courses.
Yeah.
Now, this is the interesting thing that I find in our culture today. People get really upset about spoilers. It's like spoiler alert, right? Please don't spoil it for me. If you hear, and I don't want to knock anybody, but if you hear any sermon, it's full of spoilers.
Right. Right.
It's basically robbing you of the experience of going through it course by course. Like, here's this development. Now let's digest that. Now here's the next one. You have to, and this is what you learn when you're writing and you're crafting a story. You have to build in digestive periods for people for each part. It's like, first this happens. You have to deal with the emotions of that event, the processing of that event, and you can't force it. And this is what you learn when you write. It's like, I want to move to the next piece. It's like, well, hold on. You need a scene here where the characters process what just happened to them. Yeah. And then you'll have a scene where they all sitting around and going, well, that was crazy, wasn't it? And then you can move to the next event, And this is what frustrates me when it comes to the Bible stories is, it's like someone says, well, here's how it ends. Okay, now let's go.
And let me tell you how to like,
Yes.
There's a craft to the sermon. There's an art there that I think you're touching on, because you let people sort of digest this, let them think on it, and what you have then is you have a art form, and I'm sort of dreaded air quotes here because it's like not for the purpose of manipulation, but for the purpose of like you want people to participate in the giving of God's word. It's not meant to just inform or entertain, though it can do both. You're meant to participate with it, and you need that moment of like, and this is maybe where you could have a whole nother conversation about liturgy and the pattern of your worship service needs to have those moments where you're reflecting, whatever it might be. So,
and liturgy is the same pattern. That's why you have communion at step 6. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the feast. I think I've been putting together a Bible course that's only running 5 years late, but I'm just scared of making videos. I tell you, I've written most of it, but it's just like, I'm going to bite the bullet this year. But one thing I've been watching lots of videos about making courses and stuff. One thing that struck me was the realization that people are saying now. People don't want information; they want transformation, and that's what Justin was saying. That you've got to allow time for things to have their impact, and they've got to be cumulative. But the best example I could think of was a New Tribes Mission video where they come in contact with a tribe in Indonesia, and they were really primitive, and they spent 6 months learning their language and producing a written language for them. And then they spent another 6 months teaching through the Bible. And so they went through all the major events of the Old Testament. They didn't reveal anything beforehand. It was just, this is what you're just going to teach. this is creation. This is what happened after that. Da, da, da. So they had all of the background story, and then they came to the crucifixion and they taught the crucifixion, and then they just left it hanging for a couple of days, and these people were just devastated. They were just like, "Oh,
For 3 did they leave it
like,
for 3 days?
Oh my God, like I don't know if it was 3 days, but it was, it might have only been like the next day, but they left it that day at least, and you could just see these people are just, this is just, our hope is gone. It's just, that's it. And so it's the idea of allowing the story to do what it's meant to do. So but I think too, when you're talking about crafting a sermon, I think that's called homiletics, where you've got to, and I remember watching a doco about Charles Spurgeon, who was really good at this, the drama of the sermon, but you just think he had a natural skill and it just kind of rolled out. He didn't have to it was just how he was made, and he was an amazing preacher. But then I learned that he would agonize over the structure of the sermons to get the maximum impact, but also to let the Bible's drama itself come through that, because so often we don't get the drama of the text itself. We have to manufacture our own drama and bring in our own dramatic anecdotes and things from our lives, because we're not really in tune with the drama that's actually in the text.
Right.
So I don't.
My story is somehow more applicable. Yeah.
Sorry.
As though my story is somehow more applicable. This Bible story is so far away.
Yeah, I like to say, if you understood biblical typology and symbolism and could make the dramatic connections in the text, we wouldn't have to hear your baseball stories.
Right.
Yeah.
Man, I think that's this is good, and I think we are hopefully returning to something of that. That's why something of an oral tradition, something of an oral culture as podcasts like this pop up. And Michael, I'm excited to hear about your course, because if you can make the video, I think there's something to it, right? There's something to it.
Yeah,
you got to get
just
the
like
medium.
Bite the bullet, get it out there, but also too, because it's very visual. There are there's diagrams and they're animated, and I've done some of that. That's not a problem.
There's a lot of work.
Stuff. But I'll get there. It's a lot of fun, and it really goes through the sort of gives you the keys to the basic structure and how the Bible's built, and it's a bit like teach a man to fish in that sense. It teaches people how to teach themselves. Yeah. And how to. Justin, I wasn't having a go at your baseball movie, by the way. Okay, like that was
my baseball movie. Oh no.
Was it baseball? I don't know. But
that's all right.
Yeah, personal anecdote, fine, but it's when you have to illustrate the text and keep referring to things outside of Scripture. It's not necessarily bad, but
it's sort of, but it's sort of a sign that we don't see the application. We don't see it in the text. We're trying to get to a point that we see in the text, but then we go outside the text to try to illustrate that, when the text is really doing that, in a lot of ways for us.
All we've stripped everything away from it, and we've just got the moral of the story from the text, and then we have to build other things onto it. So
Well,
so I teaching young people is great. Good on you.
Yeah. I
think that they're just so everybody kind of knows, like what I see is the lay of the land right now. People working on this, which is working on looking at it as a story, looking at the symbolism, looking at awakening the imagination. Now, we've been a part of the little corner of the internet, which is Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Peugeot and all the big kind of contingent of the Orthodox side. And I'm going to go to the Symbolic World Summit in a couple weeks.
Oh, man.
John, so the Peugeot brothers and then the Lord of Spirits guys, the two priests that are doing that podcast, the Lord of Spirits, they're kind of doing something very similar. And then now the Theophilus Institute as well, and that's within the Reformed tradition. So what I'm seeing is multiple traditions sort of recovering this narrative sense and this imaginative sense and this kind of like intriguing, exciting sense of it from all these different directions. So from Orthodox, from Reformed, YouTube people, and then Theological Institute people, and theologians, and so there's a lot of stuff going on right now that I think is kind of all, because maybe it's the right moment for it in our culture or something like that, all kind of like coming together, which will create this kind of mini renaissance in the arts. Because what happens is like that story, immersing yourself in that story, creates the Lord of the Rings, and it creates the Chronicles of Narnia. There's a reason why those two guys made like probably some of the most influential literature of the 20th century, is because they went upstream to recover that pattern, and then they put it in their creative work, and in Lewis's case, his apologetic work. That's what people are doing, I think. And what you're going to see, and this is a prediction, is you're going to see a lot of very, very good, deep, immersive stories in the creative world, in movies and TV or novels or whatever, possibly the visual arts as well, that will emerge out of this. Because I think I see it happening. If you know what to look for, everybody's working on the same thing.
That's really interesting. That is really key. And I think that hearing you gives me a lot of hope, because I think I have a sense of that. I wish I saw it, and I see exactly what you said. And I think I just need to remind myself of it more. The one drawback to sort of the digital world is you do kind of feel like you're isolated. I mean, I'm just sitting in, my upstairs extra room here, and so that gives me a lot of hope. I am really bummed that I'm going to miss the Symbolic World Summit, partly because Martin Shaw is going to be there. And so given what you just said, Justin, I don't care who else is speaking when Martin Shaw is speaking, find Martin Shaw and listen to that guy, because and what I noticed is, I found Martin on Paul Vanderklay's channel, but he's doing a little mini circuit because he's been popping up on a few other podcasts here and there. And he's a mythologist. I mean, that's what he does. He tells stories. You'll sit down and listen to a 3-day long story from Martin Shaw. We need that. We need to recapture that. So, hey, real quick, I'm gonna. I think we just have to. We have to say goodbye. But I want you guys to show. What are you guys working on right now? Michael, I didn't give you necessarily a chance early on. I think we just sort of jumped into this. I don't even remember hitting record. We just started talking. I'm glad I hit record and I didn't forget. But in particular, you've got a book called Bible Matrix, and the subtitle to that book is really intriguing. Is that the one that the DNA?
Yeah.
The subtitle. Yep. What's the subtitle of that again?
Yeah. Introduction to the DNA of the Scriptures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So notice that. No, but I love that, because you have the matrix idea, but then you have the DNA idea, right? So that we're talking about how these patterns emerge and they are organic. And so you've captured it right there in the title of your book. I thought that was great. So
it's basically just runs through the fundamental pattern and just shows how all the major events in the Bible follow the same thing. Then there's a sequel to that called Bible Matrix 2, The Covenant Key, which just shows how God's covenants are the same thing in seed form. So in a sense, the covenant or the word from God comes first, and then that structures the events. So so there's that. Last year I put out the first volume of it's going to be 4 volumes on Isaiah, which Isaiah's always intrigued me because it just looks like such a haphazard mess. Like it just, and people who've written commentaries on it, it's like, why is it thrown together like this? It's just such a mess. But the books are fractal. Like that's it. It's the same. It's the biblical matrix pattern working at multiple levels. And I draw on other people that have noticed it in the larger shape of the book itself. David Dorsey wrote a book called The Literary Structure of the Old Testament. And as you were saying, talking about oral culture, the reason the texts are structured like this is because they were designed to be delivered as a speech. And so there were, as Dorsey points out, there were no titles or subheadings or indents or any visual markers. The markers had to be built into the text. And so that's part of why they're structured this way. But the Isaiah, the first volume, has a summary of this whole methodology at the start, which is more developed than the original Bible Matrix. It's all there, and I've drawn on a few other authors but yeah. So that's intriguing stuff to get into, and especially with Isaiah, because now it's making a lot more sense to me. What I'm working at the moment on it's a book on baptism, which is designed to annoy everybody, which offend every school, every tradition, and yet draws on every school and every tradition and puts hopefully the pieces together into what might solve this ongoing debate. So yes. Anyway, that's called. We've got pedobaptism and credo baptism. So I thought I'll call it Jedi baptism, which is basically it's like Jedi baptism, but it's all about spiritual knighthood, and it doesn't have a lot to do with Star Wars. But I draw on Kierkegaard and his idea of the spiritual knight and things like that. So, but it's not just about baptism; it's about the whole. What is the way?
Right.
That they talk about in the Book of Acts. What is this way of living? But it's been good for me too, because it's I get really convicted by some of the stuff that I write.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Well,
that's what I'm working on.
Awesome. Justin, what do you got? What are you working on?
Oh, just my YouTube series on story. Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
So, Michael, this is your introduction, I think, to this little corner of the internet. This is your first appearance.
Oh, we're bringing him in.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah. So
okay.
I'm about to do. I'm going to do something I should have done 2 hours ago, and there we are. Okay. So I've been looking off into the corner the whole time. If anybody made it this far, I'm sorry. I've just been sort of off in my own section of this video, but there we go.
You've actually done really well today, and I'm really impressed with this software. It's a lot better than Zoom.
I thought so. And one of the things that I want to do, I guess this will be me sharing my project, is I want to do more. I'm going to call it a digital dialogue. I'm not going to call it an interview because I didn't have a list of questions. And eventually even bringing people in on a live stream. That is, as far as an introduction to this little corner, that is something that I think is very powerful. Something that I observed Paul doing early on was just inviting people into conversation. And that's what we need. I think that, there's so much that I think, I don't even know how to unpack it, but I just feel like it's going to change the world. I'll just say like that. I think it's going to, Justin has touched on this, but just there's sort of like an awakening. We're recapturing something. And I think one of the ways we're going to recapture it is figuring out how to use these tools so that we're not being used by them, but we're actually using them for the kingdom of God. And so, thanks StreamYard, I guess, for putting together a decent software that allows us to talk from all the way around the world. I really appreciate you guys. Really appreciate you guys hanging out with me and just chatting. I love this again because, Michael, Justin, we've never really met before. We've interacted a little bit on X, which is another digital tool for this, but there's some way we can still. I think that the sort of proof is in the pudding that something is going on when we can just sort of jump in. It's just like, okay, we're gonna have dialogue, we're gonna have meaningful conversation about things that are important.
Especially people from different schools as well. But I think one reason that we need this sort of symbolic renaissance is because symbolism got a bad name because it was abused, and people could, you can make the Bible symbolize lots of things that it doesn't actually mean. And I think that's where this recognition of structure comes in. It's almost like, I like to say, the Bible's got its own guardrails built in. If you're looking at the isolated images, you need the sprockets on the film, in a sense, to actually help you interpret it.
That is actually so good. I think that is a great point because, yes, I think a lot of people fear going into kind of the idea of story because you could make it mean anything you want. But the Bible doesn't allow you to do that because you've broken outside of the pattern or outside of the structure. You can't make it mean something that it never meant to mean. You know, you can't make it mean something it didn't mean to mean.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the reason that we sort of became scientific about it was because people wanted to avoid speculation.
Right.
And so that was a good thing. It's like we need to stop this abuse of symbolism. And they wanted some verification, some tools for verification, but then they had to make up their own rules, and of course those rules don't work. But I think now it's the desire for verification is the actual structures built into it. It's what's actually what you had seen, giving it the story bits of jagged edges and some weird bits and whatever. But once you see what the key is, it's structured, and that actually is that's the safety that you're looking for.
Yeah, the
and
guardrails.
Now
like
we
you
know
said.
what it is, but then it allows the symbols to be verified in that sense, and we can actually get to the author's intent.
Yeah. Lovely. That's good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I'm not going to end our time necessarily.